Good morning, AP Bio fans. When last we were talking about stuff like Hardy-Weinberg, which we worked on yesterday, we left out here. We had gone through the theoretical Hardy-Weinberg stuff that you would need to say that a trait was in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. We looked at PKU, which is about one of the examples that is close to being in equilibrium. And then we left. What can change allele frequencies? And really there's three things. Natural selection, which is the only one that really directly affects adaptation and evolution. But then you have both genetic drift and gene flow. And this is some of the stuff that we're setting up for your activity you're going to do this weekend, which is the video you're going to watch right after this one that I've been setting you up for. Anyhow, let's just take a quick look. So as you're doing the activity and graphing, you know what's going on. Okay. Natural selection, we know we're going to talk more about that later. Differential success in reproduction results in certain alleles being passed to the next generation in greater proportions. Again, natural selection, and we try and stay away from the term survival of the fittest because you don't have to be the fittest to survive and reproduce. It's just that the more you're adapted to that environment, the greater opportunity and the greater chance you have of passing on genes that are more beneficial in that society. Okay. But certainly natural selection can change allele frequency. For example, and this is a bit dated, I'll have to update this one, but I think your book talks about it, is DDT. DDT 4 or 5 years ago when I was a young kid was a pesticide that was widely used. In fact, DDT was one of those things that almost wiped out the bald eagle population. But it was an insecticide, but then things would eat the insects, and DDT had this cumulative effect of poisonous effect on the food chain because it just stayed. And so the things that ate the buggies built up the poison, and things that ate the bugs. So like with bald eagles eating, mice and whatever, this and that, and it caused deformities, like in the bald eagles in their claws, so they couldn't grasp and die off. Anyhow, point being, those that were resistant to DDT then would be the ones that would survive, and so that allele frequency would increase. DDT is now illegal. It has been for many years, but anyhow, that gives you an idea. Let's talk more about genetic drift and gene flow. And there's different categories under genetic drift, but here's the basic idea. One of the problems with genetic drift is you might have a small sample size, a small population. So the smaller that population, the greater the chance of deviating away from Mendelian type percentages and Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium percentages. So really, genetic drift, as it says there, is how do alleles frequencies fluctuate unpredictably from one generation to the next. And generally, genetic drift leads to a reduction in the gene pool, a reduction in variation through the loss of alleles. There is some ability to research this in human populations, although it's getting harder and harder and harder. You have to find populations that still isolate themselves on social or religious reasonings and stuff. But you can see it, but it's not hard to see in plenty of other organisms. Okay, so here's an example. So here you got a bunch of flowers, and you can see that you are your dominant, your P allele, the red allele is 70%, where the white allele, the recessive allele, is only 30% in this population. But remember, not every organism in any population that gets to reproductive age reproduces, right? So you had a small sample size here, and only 5 of those plants had offspring, as opposed to the whole 10. And if you look at the offspring that came through, now you got a 50-50 frequency of the allele. But then what happens if only 2 of those plants leave offspring and they're all red and they're all homozygous dominant? And that's genetic drift. In small populations, you can deviate quickly because not everyone is reproducing, and you can really lose alleles. And now in that small population, there is only one allele, and everybody will be that direction. And if you think about it, that's part of the problem with some endangered species and why they're trying to introduce, and we'll look at an example that your book talks about, but why with certain endangered species, they're trying to introduce other alleles to strengthen the population, because oftentimes when you're losing those alleles or getting that small, those deleterious alleles rise dramatically, and the survivability of the organism drops dramatically, because you can really highlight alleles that are not beneficial to the organism. Okay. One of those types of drift they call founder's effect. And how do these things happen? And this could be it, think of, to an extent, of Darwin's finches. Founder effect occurs when a few individuals become isolated from a larger population. Allele frequencies in the small founder population can certainly be different than in the larger parent population. And so you can see you had some migration to this new island, but not all of them came, and the ones that came didn't have the same allele frequency. Okay. Another one is called bottle effect in genetic drift. And you can see this is a natural disasters. As it says, bottleneck effect, sudden reduction in population size due to a change in the environment. Just think of a natural disaster that suddenly maybe wiped out a bunch of things, a flood, a massive heat wave, a fire in the forest, a big raging fire in the forest, tornado, anything along that line. The resulting gene pool of those who are left, okay, especially those really geared towards that environment, certainly has every possibility not being reflective of the original population. Okay. And then add into the fact that the normal genetic drift that will go in with that bottleneck effect. So here's a standard cartoon that you see with this. There's our original population, but then you have some sort of natural disaster, and what you end up is there's a surviving population. You've lost alleles and changed things dramatically. Not just natural disasters, though. Understanding bottleneck effect can increase understanding of how human activity affects other species, and you can see the manatees there and what motorboats and stuff are doing on the Florida coast to that population. Okay. So as we encroach on territories, climate change, another one that would be a bottleneck effect. Bottleneck effect, blah, blah, blah. All right. So what's the impact of genetic drift? And this is the endangered species changing population that your book goes over. It talks about the greater prairie chickens in Illinois. And so loss of that prairie, as Illinois, a big farming state, like a lot of them in the Midwest, as a lot of the natural prairie that was in Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, was reduced for farming and living and everything else as the human population expanded. That loss of prairie habitat, those birds that survived had very low levels of genetic variation, and only half of their eggs hatched. Okay, and this, you can see this picture from your book. There's the greater prairie chicken. There was the original before the bottleneck issue. Now here in 1993 is after, of course, all the land is, a lot of the land is slated for farming, and of course Chicago's in this area, which, you know, everybody in Illinois tells you they're from Chicago because it takes up an expansive area. But you can see just by the table, the number of alleles per loci and the change in the percentage of eggs that hatched. Now, surrounding areas, Kansas and Nebraska, that didn't have such drastic loss of prairie habitat, which we could make jokes about, because nobody wants to live there, haha. But you can see that their populations remained viable. So researchers use DNA from museum specimens of prairie chickens to compare the genetic variation before and after, to figure out what alleles were lost at the loci they were lost, and then introduced greater prairie chickens from populations in other states. And by introducing those new alleles, now, are they the exact, to use an agricultural term you hear at the farmer's market now about heirloom tomatoes and stuff? Was it exactly the Illinois prairie chicken anymore? No. I mean, it's still in Illinois, it's prairie chicken, but it has alleles from other populations from different states, which will also have different alleles based on their environment. Prairie is prairie, but it does have its differences. But you can see how they brought the hatch rate up. And this is the kind of things they're trying to do with, say, like cheetahs. Okay, so let's talk about genetic drift, really for postulates. It is significant in small populations. Allele frequencies change at random. Can lead to a loss of variation with populations, often does, because you lose allele. And then those harmful alleles can become fixed in that population if that was the allele that benefited from the change. And so then you see a loss of viability in the organism. Okay. So what's gene flow? Gene flow is just introducing new genes into a population. Okay. And this is huge as we have become a huge global world. And as things get shipped and different organisms come in those containers and that packaging and everything else, and you hear about invasive species and stuff all the time that overtake things. There's examples for many, 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 many years of stuff occurring along that line. But the whole concept is gene flow consists of the movement of alleles among the populations, transferred through the movement of fertile individuals or gametes, like pollen and stuff like that. Gene flow tends to reduce variation among populations over time. It can also enhance variation. It depends. This is, you got to look at each situation and what it does. Okay. So it can either increase or decrease fitness. One of the examples in your book is talking about this songbird right here, that little guy right in the corner, and how from the mainland, pars major on the Dutch island of Leland, mating causes gene flow between the central and eastern populations. And let me go to the map. Okay. So here's the North Sea, here's the island, here's the central, there's the eastern portion, there's the central portion, there is some mating there. But it's just off the main body of the Netherlands. Okay. Immigration from the mainland introduces alleles that decrease fitness in their environment, that aren't beneficial. They're beneficial on the mainland, not on the island. So natural selection selects for the alleles that increase the fitness. So what they're finding is that birds in the central region, where there's much more immigration, have lower fitness, where birds in the east with low immigration have a higher fitness. Okay. So you got a lot of things going on here. You've got some mating between these two. There's gene flow. But you also have folks coming in from the mainland, and this is where the most immigration occurs. And you look at just the plots there, okay? And because the genes coming from the mainland have lower fitness, you can see that, you know, those in the central population struggle, whereas there's very little, apparently they can't fly this far, but there's very little mainland introduction of alleles here. And so you can see still a strong concentration. All right. Now, gene flow also can increase the fitness of a population. And this, in a sense, fits in with what we talked about genetic drift and introducing new alleles to things that are, like they did with the prairie chickens or they're doing with cheetahs. Consider, for example, the spread of, I don't remember if this is talked about in your book, for alleles resistant to insecticides. Insecticides have been used to target mosquitoes that carry West Nile virus and malaria. Alleles have evolved in some populations that confer that resistance to the mosquitoes. Okay. So the flow of those insecticide-resistant alleles can increase the fitness. Okay. So they're not as affected by the mosquitoes because of the insecticide resistance. Or shall I say it this way? The mosquitoes survive the insecticide, is what I meant to say, because of the resistance they built in. So it makes them more fit for that environment. Gene flow itself, an important agent of evolutionary change. This was an old Time magazine cover from a long time ago. Because over time, gene flow, over long periods of time, gene flow can reduce the differences between populations. And you can see it now. While some of these things like Tay-Sachs disease and sickle cell and some of these disorders we've talked about have in their history an effect on different populations, different ethnic groups. A lot of that was derived from the social aspect of marrying within your religion, marrying within your ethnic group, marrying without. As the world has grown and expanded, you see those frequencies changing. And while this it's going to take many more generations, because honestly, we just, in the scope of time, we are just at the very beginning of the world being opened up. But you can see it in invasive species, you can see it in stuff, and you can see it in slight changes in human disorders that traditionally were much more prevalent in certain religious or ethnic groups, and you can see that changing a bit. Anyhow, that gives you an idea. We're going to stop there. We can look at natural selection at a different time, but I want to stop there and then direct you to the Hardy-Weinberg Lab video to see what you're going to be doing with that. Anyhow, have a great day. We'll talk to you soon.